Hello, dear Craftworldians! Aleksandra Mrs. Craftworld is with you, and welcome to a new tutorial. This time I will guide you through my painting of Ezekiel's box art with a few part lessons. Ezekiel is a Halloween special project done in collaboration with Craftworld Studio. We were approached by the guys from Craftworld Studio to work together on this Halloween release. It was good timing as we immediately thought of presenting the character Marko created for our Morkborg campaign, an RPG we were playing at the time. The Morkborg universe is a grim and dark, and NPC Ezekiel turned out to be a rising star in our sessions. Marko created a concept and a background story for this character that was later translated into illustration by Tullio Brito in his style to fit with the miniature line of Craftworld Studio. Giovanni Greco sculpted Ezekiel in all his glory, and I, Aleksandra, had the honor to paint this miniature as a box art. This was a very special project for me, as next as collaboration and bringing Ezekiel to life, it is one of Marko's characters from our RPG campaign that I really wish to see as a miniature. And I hope and wish to bring more of his characters to life. And seeing this one, would you agree? Ezekiel was printed using a Frozen Mini 8K, so we prepared a special discount lasting until October 29th. See more in the post description. There is a discount code for Scale 75 products available for our Patreon community. And let's start with painting. I prepared and primed the miniature and base using black matte primer. In the first step, I want to add highlights and create overall volume of the figure and the base. I am using Scale 75 Artist white paint, diluted and thinned in airbrush, and I am covering light placement areas with white paint. I created a little preview in the left corner of the video. It is a sketch of light and shades. You can proceed with this step using either brush or airbrush. Airbrush is faster. This is why I use it, as deadlines for painting next to filming are not always convenient. If you proceed with this step with a brush, you can easily work out a stronger contrast, like I did on the corner preview. With volume sketched in the first step, I can easily follow up this idea through my further progress and not lose track of the light placements. Second step is underpainting, and I will apply this step in thin glazes so that the volume sketch I shaped before stay visible. Once again, I am using an airbrush, but this step can easily be done using brushes. Thin down your painting layer by diluting it to a glaze consistency. We want this layer to be transparent. This way, the shade and light sketch underneath will be visible through the layer. Magenta placed over black areas will change black to a warmer tone and complement it. In gray areas, it will look more purplish, while over white areas, it will look bright and saturated. Next color I'm adding is Crimson Red. I will apply this paint in focal point, coming from the upper side. This red will give the liveliness and saturation to my underpainting, since the skin of Ezekiel will be very pale, undead looking. Layer consistency is still glaze, since I want to keep under volumes visible and also because I want colors that I apply to overlap, creating nice gradients. I decided to add one more color in shades, and that is dark ultramarine. Since Ezekiel will be on a base scene with glowing candles and pumpkins, I wanted to make sure to have enough contrast with dark and lights. Slowly, using ultramarine glaze, I am applying thin layer in shade parts of the model, boosting volumes of overall figure further. Before proceeding to overlapping layers, first I need to take care of a few details. In the first step, I sketched the overall volume. But to make nice contrast for the facial details and the recesses, I am creating a mix between emerald green and magenta. getting this bluish purple tone. I'm using this tone to darken the recesses of the clothes, but also to shade nose patches, give the shades to upper eyelids and brows, mouth and around the face. I added shades to all details in depth throughout the model. More emerald in a mix, tone gets more toward blue. More magenta in the mix, tone gets more toward purple. Now, let's paint Ezekiel's skin and get those layers overlap. First thing I do is mix the skin tones. I'm using pastel green, Naples yellow and a bit of primary red and white. If you have been following our lessons for some time now, you will know that I would never make a constant mix. I do not aim to mix one tone and use it. I plan to play with tonal variations and to have them help me in creation. For the skin pale as Ezekiel, these tonal variations will be barely noticeable, but even then, they will make the difference. They will bring life to his dead skin. Well, that is the definition of undead, living dead, right? And Ezekiel is not actually undead, he is just scary looking. If he saw something similar to an undead zombie creature, he would freak out. As you could notice in the video process, first layers I am applying are thinned down to a thin layer consistency. This thin layer is very close to a glaze. The difference is, we don't want this layer to serve as a glaze. Rather, we want to use our brush strokes to create the first of the mid-tone shapes, with the mid-tones being transparent. Dilute your paint, load your brush, but before applying a thin layer to a mini, gently tap the bristle to a tissue to drain excess water. And if it is convenient, try the layer by leaving the first brushstroke on your skin. It shouldn't be too wet, but also not too dry. You want to keep the smooth flow of your brushstroke, so the layer consistency next to thin needs to have certain hydration for an easy brush movement. As I mentioned, tonal variations. This means that in a mix of pastel blue and Naples yellow, tone will vary. It will get more to a yellow side or more to a green. Since I added primary red to a mix, it might get more to orange and somewhat to a grayish tone, since green and red are complementary. So you see, in a mix of these three paints, I get more tonal variations, and by applying these tones in thin layers over previously done underpainting, tonal variations overlap the underpainting and create more tones. For example, if I apply the same tone over white surface and over red surface, this tone will look differently. Over white surface, it will look bright and clear, while over red, it will change its hue. One more thing you can notice in my painting process is that I keep underpainting in shades. Purplish tone in shade give the nice contrast to greenish midtones. And by having these greenish midtones overlap, they are affected by the purple underpainting. And with this color play, I am building nice tonal harmony. Connecting all these colors I am using together by affecting their hue. As I'm proceeding to highlights, I'm slowly adding a white paint to a previously created mix of Naples yellow, pastel green and primary red. Once again, I'm not focusing on creating one tone, rather I'm creating more tonal variations, even if those are just slightly more yellow, orange or green. And with white, I'm making these tones brighter. I'm using brighter tonal values of the same tones I used for midtones to apply highlights. For our highlight layers, I'm lowering the area of application, mostly focusing on the forehead, brows, cheekbones, upper lip and chin. Layer consistency get a bit thicker when I get to lighter tones, simply because with defined shades and midtones, highlights are there to finalize definition of the shape and detail. Therefore, I need to make these layers solid and firm, defining the shape with final highlights. When creating a contrast between light and dark, especially for the skin, we don't tend to go from darkest to lightest values in a high percentage. Strongness of contrast will depend on a skin tone and ambience. In this case, with pale skin tones, shade will not be in their darkest values. So to achieve good contrast, I need to build values up to a very bright level. But also, I can always play with tonal contrast. By having the magenta and red in underpainting versus greenish values of the skin tone, I am creating nice tonal contrast in the skin, creating visible volumes without pushing darker shades or brighter lights. When I am working around the shade areas and sides of the face, tonal values are not too bright, keeping the contrast as soft as possible, depicting the skin. Likewise, in light placement areas, shades are brighter as well as light, so the contrast between shades and lights is still soft, displaying the different shade depth of the little facial details, such as wrinkles versus stronger shade values, such as underneath the chin, for example. To have his mouth visible and differ from the skin, I will play again with darker purples and reds, with strong light reflection depicting wetness. To achieve a wet-looking mouth, first create an overall volume with soft contrast between dark and light, and then add very strong light on the edge of the lip. It is a place where the lip is plump, so it bends, and that simple light reflection adds to a definition of a lip shape. When it comes to nose patches, I will keep them in surrounding ambience, depicting reflections of the skin tones, so it doesn't take too much attention from the face of the character. Now, let's repeat the overlipping layer technique on the skin of an arm. Once again, over magenta crimson underpainting, I am applying a greenish tone created in a mix between pastel green, Naples yellow, and primary red. The first overlipping layer is diluted to a thin consistency, making first brushstrokes adapt to an underpainting and create a tonal variation between shades and midtones. Skin tone mix is not a constant. It varies from green to orange or yellow, all desaturated to a pastel value. As I am proceeding to a build volume of an arm and its muscles, using lighter values, I am increasing the consistency to a thicker values. There are a few painting fundamentals I am sharing with you in this lesson and Ezekiel paint-along guide. The first fundamental is volume. If you deduct underpainting and overlipping layers, you will notice that the main follow-up through the lessons are volumes. First overall volumes, then details. The second fundamental is contrast. Not only the contrast between light and dark, but also tonal contrast. Which leads us to the third fundamental, and that is color use. By using colors and their tonal variations, I'm able to create different contrast textures and definitions. And all of that is possible because of the fourth fundamental, and that is brushstrokes. All the techniques I'm using require good usage of brushstrokes and layer consistencies. Since this is only the first part of Ezekiel tutorial, there will be more words about brushstrokes, especially when I cover painting of other materials. When it comes to a light placement and defining volumes, I'm making sure to keep overall arm cylinder volume shape while defining the muscles. All the muscles are round looking, so first I'm adding light values in the middle of the muscle shape, and I'm spreading this light in thinner lines on the lower edges of the shape. Once again, as I'm building up the midtones, shades are still dark, but as my layers are overlapping, I'm softening the shade value in upper light placements of the arm, refocusing from muscle details to overall arm volume. The tones of the lower areas of the arm are in shade and reflecting the color of Ezekiel robes. I added a mix of emerald green plus magenta to the skin mixes for darker values. Again, having these colors harmoniously work throughout the whole model. Before I continue with other details, let's go over tonal variations that are visible in the final look of the skin. After all tones mixed and overlapped, main tones visible are purple-red brownish shades with greenish-yellow skin tones. All the paints I used, magenta and crimson red in underpainting, and pastel green Naples yellow primary red in overlapping layers, settled to create this pale yet lively skin tone. Once again, I am using a mix between magenta and emerald to create shades for the Ezekiel clothes. After the overall volume initially sketched, I still give a first step to adding more shades. With all shades properly placed, I can easily continue to omit tones and highlights, speeding up the painting process. As you can notice, I'm adding these shades with a brush using glaze consistency. Since I want to keep underpainting visible in the areas where I plan to add yellow paint, I'm adding more magenta glaze, creating a nice, warmer base for a yellow tone. On the backside, tones are very dark, but I am adding this glaze in the recesses for a better contrast and definition of details. Once again, I'm proceeding to overlapping layers. I'm adding Naples yellow on the right side of the hat in a thin layer, having this layer transparently overlay magenta. I'm creating the shape of the light, defining the volume of the head and the hat. This layer is applied only as a light placement, so once again, I keep underpainting in shade areas. When placing lighter tone over darker underpainting in a thin layer, Expect this lighter layer to get lighter when dry. Go slowly with this step and experience the color and paint behavior upon overlap and drying. I am creating more thin layers overlapping in order to build tonal variations of overlapping layers to a clear Naples yellow. Before continuing to lighter values of yellow, once again considering overall volume of the hat, I will first place red side midtones. You can see the difference between yellow overlapping layer and red, now upon red layer drying. Red overlapping layer is not much brighter than the base underpainting tone. So, when dry, it gets much closer to the background tone, and it requires a few more layers to get to brighter values. I am repeating the same process on the other side of the hat, this time using primary red paint. Once again, layer I am using is thin, and as I apply the light placement shape of the hat, I am waiting for this layer to dry before I move to the next layer. As the layers overlap, they are built up to the mid-tone of clear primary red. With proceeding to highlights, I'm adding a bit of white paint into a mix, and I'm diluting the paint layer less. Density is not that thin anymore, since in this step I'm working toward the final light definition of the hat. As you will notice, steps in building midtones and highlights are the same, but the tonal variations are different. I didn't want to push the red too bright, as it might look washed out. Because of that, I made more contrast with shades. I kept the underpainting slightly darker, as you could notice in previous stages, on the red side of the hat. I'm adding a bit of white into Naples yellow and I apply a layer in higher density now, creating more contrasting shape of light. I'm focusing on the middle side of yellow cloth, that is upper edge of the head, the same light path that is strongest on Ezekiel's forehead. With this, I'm again boosting the overall volume of the head in the final highlights. On the red side, light placement is closer to the middle, once again for the overall volume. I added just a pinch of white to red paint to brighten the value. I kept the underpainting slightly darker, as you can notice in previous stages, on the red side of the hat. While on the yellow side, underpainting was brighter, because yellow is much brighter tone and it doesn't require strong shades. On this scheme, you can see tonal variations created with underpainting and overlapping layers technique. Now, let's define those patches. I'm using a neutral dirty white tone, just to signify the thread. On the back side of the hat, considering that the whole area is in shade, I mixed Naples yellow with magenta and emerald green on the palette. I went with thin layer application just to overlay the color of the hat, yellow and red, and to define the volume. I don't want to go brighter or to add saturation to those areas, as I need to keep those in shades for the overall volume of the whole figure. Now that we have Ezekiel's colorful hat done, let's add a few details for the end of today's paint-along session. What about the little bells? I love painting non-metallic metal. To me, it's fun and freeing process like painting anything else. I usually explain it as, we call it non-metallic metal, but do we call skin painting non-skin skin or fabric non-fabric fabric, right? Well, it is the painting process as everything else. Then what is fun? Fun part for me is that metal can be very reflective material. It can be done in very high contrast, reflecting the surrounding between the both shades and lights. These are just small bells, so not much is visible, but you can follow how I am simply adding colors from a palette over purple base underpainting in order to sketch the volume of the bell shape. I can easily switch to highlight that will add the definition as a light reflection over the metal surface. And just like that, the little bell is defined. I can use any surrounding tones in dark and light value and play with that, creating stronger contrast between the darks and lights for the shinier look. For Ezekiel's fancy color, I will use a mix between emerald green, primary red and Naples yellow, diluted and brightened with addition of white paint, to achieve this look of a dirty white. I want to differ from Ezekiel's pale skin tone, so I'm keeping the tonal value lower than the skin tone brightness. Slowly overlapping these layers, first as a thin layer in light shapes, proceeding to thicker layers as they reduce the light shape size, having this light spread and connect on the edges of the collar, I am defining the final shape of the collar folds. You can notice how underpainting stays visible in all shades, face, arm, hat and collar, as well as it affects overlapping layers, creating harmonious color scheme. That would be all for today's lesson, guys. I hope you all enjoy Ezekiel Paint Along Part 1. Ezekiel is available as STL for our patrons and over at Collective Studio with other STLs from their October line. There will be more parts of Ezekiel tutorial upcoming, and for those who can't do Paint Along, you can always use this lesson and techniques on other models and projects. Share your works with us on our Discord channel and social medias by using hashtags from the screen. Happy Halloween, stay tuned, and until the next one, bye bye!